Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program, where we have the opportunity to hear Melvin Rogers speak about his book, The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. He will be joined in conversation with Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. Thank you all for joining us, both in person in our community room and virtually on our live stream. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel. Tonight's multi-platform event will run for about an hour in total, and there will be an opportunity for the in-person audience to ask questions. This room is T-Coil enabled, so if you have a T-Coil enabled device, please feel welcome to switch it on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device but would like to try one of our headsets, we've made some available on the piano. To make sure the system works, it's important that everyone speaks into a microphone. This includes the audience members when you ask questions. So during that portion, please wait for a microphone to be brought to you. It just makes it easier for everyone to hear. I'd also like to thank our community partners, but first I also want to thank our Black Voices book group who canceled their event so that everyone could join here tonight, so thank you. Our beloved Labyrinth Books is co-presenting this event, and they've also made it possible for you to purchase copies of both Dr. Rogers and Dr. Glaude's books this evening. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Princeton University's Humanities Council, Religion Department, Office of the Dean of Religious Life, as well as SPIA in New Jersey and the Princeton Theological Seminary. It's now my pleasure to introduce Melvin Rogers. He's a professor of political science and associate director of philosophy, politics, and economics. He has wide-ranging interests in contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African American political thought. He is the author of several books and writings in addition to The Darkened Light of Faith, including The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy. In addition to his published writings, Professor Rogers serves as the co-editor of the Oxford New Histories of Philosophy book series. The series focuses on the unattended voices in the histories of philosophy. He received an MPhil in political thought and intellectual history from Cambridge in 2000 and a PhD in political science from Yale University in 2006. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogers.
Well, it's great to have all of you here, so thank you very much for joining the conversation. So I thought what I would do before Eddie and I begin our conversation is just try to say a couple of things about the book and the motivation in writing the book. So I would say about a decade ago, I found myself wondering, as I was reading W.B. Du Bois, I found myself wondering, so how do we make sense of the ways in which African American intellectuals, activists, artists, the ways in which they have constantly appealed to the nation, United States, constantly appealed to the nation to respond to racial inequality. How do we make sense of the ways in which they've made these appeals amid practices of discrimination and domination? Or to put it differently, how must they understand democracy in order to justify, even if only to themselves, their appeals to the nation? And what I came to realize is that if we actually focus on this question in a sustained way, suddenly what we will come to see, as I came to see, suddenly you begin to see this sort of rich idea, this rich vision of democratic life. And you begin to see some of the sort of constituent foundational elements that fuel their conception of democracy. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to sort of lay out a set of key ideas that are at work in moving these figures, that is at work in informing them as they're bringing critique to bear on the United States and as they are making appeals to the United States to transform into a racially just society. And so what are those elements? So the first element that emerges and that I discuss in the book, throughout the book, is this idea of the people. This is language that we use very regularly, both in intellectual discourse and in our public political discourse. And what do we mean when we use this? Well, sometimes we have in mind the people as a descriptive category. We mean those of us who enjoy rights and privileges per the Constitution. But there's another sense in which we use this language, the people, in which we're not talking about those who actually exist. We're talking about a configuration of ourselves that may yet be. So sometimes when the language of the people is being used, you're trying to call into existence a way of reconfiguring ourselves, a way of reconstituting ourselves that would, in that very reconstitution, respond to the grievances that are being made. But that raised a very important question for me. Well, okay, well, how do you get the people on the ground to embrace these new configurations of themselves? And one of the things that quickly emerges as you move through the tradition of African American political thought from the 1830s to the 1960s, roughly the period of the book, is the sort of importance of rhetoric. Not rhetoric in the way we typically think about it, rhetoric as a form of manipulation. No, rhetoric as a way of moving your audience from one side to another with a thought, is that if they arrive at this new position, it could be a home for both you and them. Right? And the reason why rhetoric matters in this way is because ultimately, when someone says, I'm persuaded, right, you want them to be able to live in the light of that new vision, right, that they are now claiming to have been persuaded by. And when we say we're persuaded, it's not because of, or exclusively because of what the speakers have done to us, but actually what we've done for ourselves. We've taken it in, we've thought about the arguments, the problems, the grievances that have been laid out, and we have said no, or we have said yes. Right? And one of the things I realize is that, okay, so rhetoric is partly going to help close this gap, but how do these thinkers think about us? Why do they think that we are susceptible to being persuaded? And there you discover that from David Walker, a 19th century abolitionist, to James Baldwin, these African American thinkers see their white counterparts as unfinished. That they see the polity as unfinished. And they see the polity as sites of aesthetic and emotional transformation that were works of art for them, right? And that in the process of making their appeals that they might be able to transform their white counterparts, the nation, into something that has never before existed. But they knew, as African American intellectuals continue to know now, they do not exercise control over those to whom they appeal. That's one of the other things about rhetoric. Right? Your conversation partner can say, no, I'm unpersuaded. And since they understood that you don't exercise complete control over your fellows, one of the things you quickly come to discover is that what keeps them involved in this process is their idea of faith. Because faith for these figures at bottom involves a kind of running ahead of the evidence you need to justify the appeal that you're making to your fellows. It's a deeply uncertain and fraught process. So I try to tell a story about these African American thinkers from the 1830s to the 1960s, using these ideas of the people, of rhetoric, of aesthetics, of emotion, of faith, as a way to sort of coordinate and illuminate their idea of democracy. And the final thing I think I would add here before we move to the conversation is that why are these elements important? Are they only important because they bear on questions of racial justice for these thinkers? Well, in truth, one of the things that you come to discover with these figures is that they thought that these ideas mattered, whether the issue was about racial inequality or whether it was about climate catastrophe. Because at the end of the day, to see us as works of art always in the process of unfolding, as seeing the people as something that may yet be, right? As thinking about our relationship with each other as deeply uncertain, and thus we have to, in important ways, have faith in each other. That all of these things are about the demand of democracy and the agility it requires in us as citizens. And so in some ways, what these thinkers are trying to convey and are trying to cultivate in us is a kind of democratic agility as we respond to the ongoing grievances and problems that animate our shared lives together. So I'll stop there, and then we can go over here.
Absolutely. So how are you? Good. This is exciting for me on so many different levels. We want to thank him and Dorothea and everyone for making this event possible. We want to thank the folks who are taping and the folks who set up the chairs and the folks who are going to break down the chairs and you know, that invisible labor that makes our getting together possible. So we want to just acknowledge that up front. Is that okay? So I want to just jump into this, but I want to start in a different way. Okay. And you have to answer the question though. So I want to begin with who you dedicate the book to. So there's the dedication, because I want you, before we jump into the substance, you dedicate the book to Roosevelt and Eddie Glaude. Who are they? And how do they shape the path that led you to this book?
I'm not quite sure why you want him there.
We must.
Yeah, no, because that's the kind of thing that's given me. I'm liable to come to tears. No, so they're my parents. They are no longer here. My father passed away when I started this book, and my mother left this world as I was coming to the end of it. And the book is, you know, it's dedicated to them in part because this is not the kind of path that they had imagined for me. And they never tired of telling me how proud they were of this path that I found myself on. And I think, you know, the book is dedicated to them, you know, also because my most enduring habits for living life, they came from them. And when your most enduring habits, you know, when you take stock of the sources of your existence, you can't help but acknowledge its force and its place. And so this book, I'm possible because they existed, right? So that's, you know.
Yeah, I know I caught you off guard with that question, but I wanted to begin there because I'm thinking about you know, the content, the substance of a certain kind of aspirational claim. The content and substance of a kind of faith that sets the stage for you to be possible. A kind of agility, the kind of agility that is requisite to make your way from the Bronx. You can hear it, can't you?
Louder, Eddie.
Oh, hey, the Bronx, to where you are now.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to kind of ground the abstract claims, right, in a biography that makes the claims matter, that gives them weight and substance and significance. Now, you open the text with a question. You touched on it. That's all right. We're all gonna turn off our cell phones, right? We're good. Okay, here we go. So you open up the book with a question, right? And it's a fascinating question. What is it about democracy that justifies our faith in it? And this is going to serve as the arc of our conversation, because the question has, in some ways, in its background, those who have lost faith. Why that question, and why is it so important to answer it now? And then we're going to talk about the way in which you build your answer to this. So what is it about American democracy that justifies our faith in it? But you specified even more that what is it about American democracy that justifies these black folks' faith in it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a way in which the tradition of black struggle has a great deal, there are a great many moments the tradition of black struggle can point to that suggest that the nation is actually not interested in responding to its plight. That even amid those instances, Civil War, Reconstruction, civil rights, crucial moments of transformation, collapse, transformation yet again, maybe we're in a period of collapse, of betrayal. But the fact that we keep cycling through this is an indication that the nation isn't committed to transforming itself in a way that it could be fully a racially just society. And so, if that's sort of how the cycle is often, I think, read, and the resources that black people have to point to, we have to ask the question, and we have to try to provide an answer to why it is, right, why it is that African Americans remain committed. And is this just simply an assertion of a kind of sort of religious claim? Or is there something more about the cultural, political, intellectual resources of democracy that they're drawing on in order to make sense of their commitment?
So either it's a faith claim of sorts, maybe it's perhaps naivete, that these pre-political folks just don't quite get it.
Right.
Or maybe they're doing something here,
right,
that we need to take a closer look at and to see. So there's some, the introduction is really expansive. You do a lot of work to kind of lay out the general architecture of the book. And by the way, I urge all of you to get it. It's right. Talk a little bit about freedom and equal regard as key terms here.
Right. So let me say a word. So I'll say a word about that, but let me just sort of back up a little bit.
Sure.
There's a way of thinking about the faith claim as bound to naivete, right? And so I concluded on faith, right? So there's a way in which I want to sort of disentangle faith from naivete at the end, right? But one of the things that I think is critical, which is the point that I want to emphasize in the book, is that there is something that they see about democratic life that the vast majority of us take for granted. That is to say that there are resources that we're relying on that they are now making explicit for us, right? And that it's crucial to track that, and that if we sort of track it clearly, we will see these folks as sort of deep and profound contributors to our discourse and understanding of democracy. In other words, this is part of our shared inheritance, right? Two of the driving ideas, which will be familiar to this audience, that is at work, is the idea of freedom and the idea of equality. And freedom here, for these thinkers, is not just simply about being free from the intrusions or interferences of government and the way we typically sometimes talk about this in our public discourse. This is about being free from domination. And what does domination mean? Well, you're dominated when you're at the arbitrary mercy of people that can exercise power over you. And these can be individuals who are actually quite benign. It doesn't matter that they're benign, right? They could deploy their power at any moment. That's what it means for it to be arbitrary. You never know when it's going to come. And to that extent, you're dominated. Ida B. Wells, for example, who I talk about in the book, just to give one example, she talks about the sort of unwritten laws of American life. Ida B. Wells is writing at the tail end of the 19th century, and she's discussing lynching. And she talks about, with a simple word, a black person could be lynched. What does she mean by that? Right? She means that there's something about the cultural logic of the United States in this period that potentially authorizes any person to use a single word to lynch a black person. That's what it means to be dominated. So black folks, on the one hand, are trying to sort of guard against that, which both includes, obviously you want laws on the books that could protect you, but you also want, right, communities, you want the members with whom you share society, right, to work in tandem to guard against domination. And then the other idea is equal regard or equality. And in some ways, the first, freedom, partly gets off the ground because of the second. It is precisely because I don't regard you as an equal that I feel empowered to dominate you. Right? And so these thinkers thought and believed that these two things must go together, with equality serving as the guiding light to sort of discipline and direct freedom to its proper destination. And that if it does that, it would sort of display itself, that was the hope, that it would display itself in not just simply laws and policies with respect to racial discrimination and inequality, but it would display itself in the ordinary, everyday interactions between black folks and their white counterparts.
So when we begin to think about or interrogate the lives, the thoughts, the thinking of these people, you say that we find resources to think about democracy in a somewhat different way, to think about freedom and equal regard in a more robust way. What are these resources? Kind of give us a sense of what are the resources you find here. I mean, that you think are so generative, or that you commend to us as you read this.
Right. So let's take the freedom idea for a moment. So in our contemporary discourse, but it's not unique there, it has a history. The way you sort of guard against the interferences that would come from governmental intrusions is to make sure that you have a catalog of rights that can serve as appropriate shields around you and that can provide the appropriate directives to governments to ensure that your life is not being interfered with. The way this gets off the ground in our public discourse and in our policies happens partly because you are recognized as someone that has standing, and as a result of having standing, you have rights attached. Okay? What happens if I never thought you fit to have standing? This is to say, if I never regarded you as the kind of person, I thought I turned this off, I apologize. If I never regarded you as the kind of person that was worthy of those protections, is this the kind of thing that can simply be repaired by, let's say, establishing a set of constitutional protections? Keep in mind, I never regarded you as the kind of creature fit for those rights. So one of the things that these African American thinkers was trying to get their fellows to recognize, and this is one of the resources, is that legal recognition, having constitutional norms in place that will protect you, matter a great deal, but they are meaningless if I never thought that you had standing. So why is it that I don't think that you have standing? Well, it has something to do with the ideas, the concepts, the beliefs that are in circulation in the wider culture. So in the 19th century, for example, a thinker that I talk about in the book, Hosea Easton, is very much concerned about the kinds of stories that are read to kids about black children and black people, and the ways in which those stories habituate black children to seeing black people as non-human. White children as non-human. And that this habituates them to disregard the humanity of their black fellows. Right? You all with me here? Mm-hmm. So this is a sort of long-winded way, but I want to go this route. Mm-hmm. Because part of what these African American thinkers are trying to convey is the necessity of putting in wider cultural circulation ideas about value, right? Ideas about the humanity of black people that can serve as the basis upon which laws can be built. Because the thought is that if you put laws in place, but your fellows don't properly regard you, they can figure out all kinds of ways to deform good laws and good institutions, as Hosea Easton wrote. So here's one resource. But the resilience of our freedom is not exclusively found in law. It's found in our willingness, right, to recognize our fellows, right, as worthy of, as fit for, right, the freedom that we find so central and so important to our constitutional order. And that in fact, were their freedom compromised, something about us would be compromised. It's not a legal claim. It's a cultural claim about how we see each other.
So you do this across a number of different figures, and you offer very interesting and powerful readings of Walker, of Easton, Ida B. Wells, and Du Bois, and Billie Holiday, and of course Baldwin, not necessarily in that order. Why those particular figures to make this argument, and not some others?
Well,
Why choose them?
Right, well, there's sort of two kinds of answers here. So the first answer is that the book is not in its scope exhaustive.
Right.
So the first kind of answer is that you should be able to read the book and then wonder, well, who else could fit in this narrative? Let me look a bit more deeply in the 19th century, a bit more widely. Let me look a bit more deeply and widely in the 20th century. So you should be able to do that, and there will be other figures that will emerge that should be able to fit. I'm confident that will be able to fit in this story. So these are sort of representative figures. But the sort of second reason why these figures are selected is because these are the figures that I wanted you to think with me as I work through this argument, right? So in some sense, they are illustrious of this sort of broader claim that I'm making. They're exemplary figures in this regard. And I think that they provide the most, they are the most powerful articulations, or they offer the most powerful articulations of the view that I'm advancing in the book.
So I want to get to questions, but I'm trying to walk us through the text so you can see its various components. Okay, so we want to get to questions at some point, but there are two more. And one, the first has to do with the audience, the nature of your intervention. So you're making these broader claims, but you're also making a specific claim to political theory. On page 101 and 102, you make it explicit. You say to the effect. You don't say to the effect, you say this, you write this. Despite the neo-Republican revival in political theory and history and the significance of the United States as a primary historical site for understanding the meaning of republicanism, African Americans have been oddly left out of view. Then the second claim you make is that surely when we attend to the ongoing problem of slavery in the United States and the ascendance of Jim Crow, in the wake of the Civil War, we shall find the language of republicanism very much alive. Unpack those two claims for us very quickly, and then I want to get to that.
Right. So first, republicanism here that I'm using refers to a philosophical tradition that goes back to the Greeks and the Romans. And the hallmarks of the Republican tradition include an emphasis on the importance of civic virtue to political life. But the reason why civic virtue matters is because it helps to make all of us, the thought is, civically agile and ready to protect our freedom against domination. And there has been an intellectual revival in this discussion of republicanism, which emphasizes the significance of domination and the ways in which Republicans have tried to resist this, that is to say, the philosophical tradition. And what has been so striking is that one would think, wow, you're looking for various peoples that have tried to resist domination. You have a great deal to say about the United States. It might be useful to see what African Americans have had to say about it. But they have not attended to those voices. And so part of what I'm doing is, on the one hand, saying that republicanism was very much active in the 19th century, where some of these figures claim that it was not. And it was very much active among African Americans, and if you pay attention to them, you will see how they're engaged in a series of revisions to this tradition, but revisions to this tradition that's taken place on the ground. Right? That's taken place in how they're engaged in activism and how they're writing, and revisions that sort of shift the discussion of republicanism away from simply focusing on constitutionalism and legal protections to focusing on what cultural norms must be put in place in order to sustain a republic in the first place. And so they resist the claim, as once said by Immanuel Kant, that look, you know, you construct a great constitution, you get it together, and it can be run by a race of devils. They resist that claim. And they resist it because their argument is good laws, good constitutions. If we're deformed, they will be deformed in turn.
So here we are in this moment. It's a very dark one, where it seems as if the republic is on the edge of the abyss, where the very idea of American democracy is at stake. Once again, right, our darker angels have overrun much of what we take to be the best of the public, as it were. What do you do? Because you end with Baldwin. I'm just thinking about the arc, right? Yes, the way in which we imagine X, we have left aside these these resources that African Americans offer us for thinking about a certain nature, a certain kind of civic virtue that orients us differently to the problems we face. If we perhaps mine those resources, we may, in fact, acquire some tools to help us think of ourselves differently in relation to these choices that haunt. We continuously fail, over and over again. The Afro-pessimist, a crude version of Afro-pessimism, might find these claims a bit far-fetched, that you somehow haven't taken seriously about the darkness that defines this place, that anti-blackness is at the heart of the Western world, is at the heart of this particular experiment. That there's a reason why America is only once born, Melvin Rogers. And that the idea of trying to get it to be twice born, right, is a fool's errand. You are chasing windmills, they would say. How does the darkened light, and of course the darkened is acknowledging this, the darkened light of faith, respond to that claim? Because you tell the reader up front, I'm not going to deal with this black nationalist tradition. Even though Delaney comes into view. I'm not going to settle with the claim that animates black nationalism, that there's really now no real possibility for black flourishing in this place. Right? So how do you, in the end, and how does Baldwin help you respond to the claim that returns? This is just naive.
Right, yeah.
Because we don't have any end faith that this place is actually, will ever do right by us.
Right, I mean, it's, you know, I think it's a difficult question. And by the end of the book, so let me just back up a little bit. The 19th century black nationalist Martin Delaney is central in the first part of the book. And a debate is set up that sort of follows history between him and Frederick Douglass, where Martin Delaney says, look, if there were any probability that the United States could be otherwise, I would commit to this place.
Right.
But I have no hope in the Republic. And so he argues for a series, or he offers up a series of proposals for African Americans to leave the United States and settle elsewhere. And Frederick Douglass responds that, look, he doesn't disagree with Brother Delaney, as he says, proposals to sort of look elsewhere for where black folks might be able to settle. He disagrees that Brother Delaney doesn't have sufficient faith that the black man could get a fair hearing on American soil. The Delaneyan voice haunts the entire book, which is what Eddie is sort of pushing on. And it haunts the conclusion. And the question is, how have these thinkers, I end with Baldwin, respond in a way that tries to be sensitive to the ways in which we keep cycling.
And we're in one right now.
To be sensitive to that, while simultaneously providing resources for continuing the long assault, the long battle, right? And one of the things that I arrive at is that, look, what Baldwin recommends is that we have to disentangle our preoccupation with progress from redemption. Right? American discourse, historically, we think of ourselves as special. And no matter how many historians come along or political scientists come along, it seems to be part of our public discourse again and again, that we think ourselves special. And our insistence on being special sometimes, and actually quite often, gets in the way of the very thing our specialness is meant to respond to. Right? Because you're so preoccupied with your specialness, you're not available to recognize the deficiencies. And Baldwin calls this our preoccupation with innocence. And what Baldwin recommends is that the United States needs to engage critically with its racial history, and it needs to see that racial history as constitutive, foundational of its identity. In other words, it has to use that racial history, it has to travel through it as a way to orient itself. But you can't travel through it without acknowledging the way in which you're stained, right? The way in which you're scarred, right? So it's a kind of trauma. It's a self-inflicted trauma, but trauma all the same. And in that kind of framework, if you take that seriously, what you're really trying to do is manage the trauma and hold it at bay and prevent it from becoming, as Baldwin would say, tyrannical. Right? And so my thought is that, look, what Baldwin is commending is a kind of chastened aspirational politics in which there are lessons to be disclosed from us taking seriously this history. It will not generate redemption, it will not generate salvation, but it could be a practice of atonement. Because atonement is a way of attending to our shared work together in light of our mistakes, our tragedies, our betrayals. And atonement is about, it's a posture. It's a way of making us alive to the ways in which that trauma reverberates across time and is always endangering the present work that you are involved in. Right? And so, whereas there's a moment where Baldwin seems like he's going to embrace pessimism. And he's engaged with the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead in the 1970s, and they're engaged in a conversation. And there's a point at which Baldwin seems deeply pessimistic. And she says, well, look, then we have nowhere to go. And Baldwin says, no, because we have atonement. And that can be the practice that sort of nurtures us. Right? And so it seems to me that that's a resource. For on the one hand, acknowledging something that I think the Afro-pessimists get right, which is about the sort of racial history of the United States and its tragedy that haunts. But I think they I think that they go too far in suggesting that there's no work for us to do. And so the question then becomes, are there resources in the tradition that can acknowledge that, but do it as sort of, acknowledge it in a way that it becomes a resource for engagement, not disengagement.
So I hope I've given you a sense of the arc of the book. And the stakes of it. There are a whole bunch of questions that I have, more questions that I could ask, but I want to open it up to you. And if you have any questions, I think Kim has the mic, and just raise your hand. And you can ask us anything. That doesn't mean we're going to answer, but you can ask anything. Here's a question here. Thank you, Melvin, for this gift.
So when you speak about atonement, I am a playwright, and my work is exploring, I wonder how my ancestors treated Black people. I asked that question. It would have never, ever occurred to me to even ask that or think that. It was 30 years ago, standing on Nassau with my then boyfriend who was Black. And we were talking about our families. And I said my great-grandfather was police commissioner of New York City from 1934 to the end of the Second World War. And as we were going into the restaurant for a date, and I told him that, he said rhetorically out loud, I wonder how he treated Black people. And it vaporized, and it wasn't until 2020, on the 4th day of the George Floyd protests, that that thought came back into my head. And I asked the question that I never would have thought to ask when I typed in Louis J. Valentine, police brutality. And in seconds, there were all the answers that I never wanted to know. And it's been my work to ask that question. And I just kind of feel like in this atonement, if we can stand up and talk about how our ancestors, how our families treated others, and what kind of work could that accomplish?
Thank you.
I mean, thank you for sharing that, right? You know, sharing that is a moment of vulnerability, right? And Baldwin was very much concerned about the various practices that we deploy in order to conceal from ourselves the ways in which we're complicit in what he considered to be the racial nightmare. And one of the things that he wanted to insist upon is that in the United States, we typically, when we think about responsibility, right, we typically think about it through the lens of liability. If I've done something, and thus can be causally connected to something, I am therefore liable for it, right? And Baldwin thought that it is that kind of model that gets in the way of what he wanted to commend was a kind of shared notion of responsibility, in which one does not have to be causally connected to the injustices for which we are responsible. That we are responsible because we belong to a shared community. And so it seems to me that that sort of framework, right, is in some ways a framework at work in what you just described. Right? There's sort of no way, in my mind, as I'm thinking about your transition, as you watched all of that, right, and then took ownership of it, although it doesn't causally follow from anything that you've done, but the sense of it being a shared inheritance to which you have to respond, right, is precisely the kind of orientation that Baldwin is recommending.
Yeah, and I would add, as a footnote, which is really important, we do so without a hint of sentimentality. Because remember that moment in Many Thousands Gone, Baldwin says, sentimentality is what? The mask of cruelty. So no crocodile tears, right? We have to confront the ugliness of who we are, right, as a precondition for us to imagine ourselves differently. But we do so, right, not because of the terror, a theological terror, or because there's guilt, right?
And in confronting it, we begin to communicate, right, new sources of value and worth for other people beyond ourselves, right? And that is what others then are bearing witness to. Right? And even as we're communicating new senses of worth and value, we must never think, we must always guard against that what we do is enough. Right? That's our slippage. Our slippage is that we think, right, this particular law, this particular statute, this particular act settles the matter. Right? And this is why we always have to be alive to the ways in which the nature of the trauma and the devastation that it is created in all our lives extend much further than any particular act, right? Any particular law we can pass.
That's a question.
Denise, Black Voices Book Room.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Denise Leslie, Black Voices Book Group at the Paul Robeson House of Princeton. I was listening to your book while I was out in the wonderful parks between Bucks County and here. And at one point you said that the people, or I thought I heard you say, that the people who were involved in enslavement had to believe that these people who they were enslaving were not human beings. And there's a whole lot of effort to convince themselves so they can do the things that they're doing. These are not human beings. And we continue to have that going on now with incarceration. How are people of color being treated? And then we go back to the law. Are enslaved people property? Are they people? And yet, you know, slave owners were sleeping with these animals. They were described as people who are good breeders. Let's keep Sally in here because she can give me 14 new slaves. So at some point, and starting with the Doctrine of Discovery, where the Pope, this is the most person closest to religion, he was close to God, was saying they're all savages. Wherever you go, don't worry about them as human beings. Take everything they've got and turn them into good Christians. So I'd like to, starting with Standing, where are we going with her question? When are these people who are part and beneficiaries of enslavement, when are they going to start believing that people of color are human beings?
I mean, that's a heavy
and it's
question.
in the law. It's in the law.
I mean, this is a heavy question. I mean, one of the things that and the reason why I end with Baldwin is because Baldwin is very clear in The Fire Next Time, as he's speaking to his nephew, that he must love his white counterparts. But what's very critical about this is that love is not meant to function as a means to unburden one's white counterparts. It's a means to unburden black people, by which I mean civic love is a partnership. And black people can go a long way in pointing the way, but one's white counterparts have to figure out and get right with themselves, right, about why it is or why it seems necessary in order to understand your concept of freedom or equality. You have to engage with those who are non-white as if they are not human. Right? What is it about the way you're thinking about freedom and equality that seems to be premised on this? Right? I always find it striking that David Walker, the first figure I begin with, abolitionist in the 19th century, he writes this appeal in 1829. It's called Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, but in particular and very expressly of the United States. The only thing I want to flag here is that he had no problem of thinking of colored citizens of the world and of the United States. In other words, that in his mind, he did not think that to acknowledge the colored citizens of the United States meant that you had to deny it in someone else, right? And so the question then becomes, how is it that one's white counterparts are conceptualizing these things? So black folks have put in circulation, the book is trying to put in circulation a sort of treasure trove of resources one can appeal to and draw on, but ultimately, I think the tradition insists, ending with Baldwin, that one's white counterparts have to work it out for themselves, and ultimately this matters. Why does it matter? You don't want the imposition of law, although law matters. You need folks to to see that something about themselves is diminished, right? At the point in which they deny the humanity of others, at the point in which they are willing to extinguish the life of others. Something about them, they need to see that. Yes.
But how are we, in this day and age, banning books, explaining what happened, what occurred, our history, not just here, but all over the world, because it might upset the kids? How can this possibly go on? Because we must know what has happened in our history and what we have done.
Yeah, you know, I love this audience. You're all great, right? Look, Darkwater, 1920, W.B. Du Bois. What is whiteness? Whiteness understood here ideologically, right? What is whiteness? Ownership of the earth, right? And if ownership of the earth, as Du Bois is thinking about it, is tied to how you come to understand your identity, right? When it appears that that space, the thing you own, is now being claimed by others,
Yeah.
something about yourself is at stake, is being diminished. So these arguments about banning books in Florida and elsewhere is about an attempt to hold on to an identity that folks perceive to be under assault.
But it's not just in Florida. It's all over the United States.
No, you're right. You're right. I just use that as one of the,
right.
The sort of central examples that I think is dominant. No, you're absolutely right. Right. But it's this question of identity, and what's at the heart of this. And I don't know if most of us are ready to accept this. What's at the heart of this is our refusal to accept the entailment of the kind of political and cultural system that we've accepted, democracy. Because democratic freedom is about vulnerability, right? Democratic freedom is about being willing to call into question your identity when it gets in the way of your connection to other human beings. Democratic freedom is a very hard thing to bear, because then we have to be prepared to let things go. We have to be willing to let things die, including features of ourselves that we've otherwise taken to be so fundamental to who we are, right? And that's, you know, this is not the kind of thing that one can just sort of adopt overnight, right? This is not about the passage of some law. This is about how do we cultivate a kind of ethos, a kind of culture in which we are sufficiently, right, agile and limber, right, to allow pieces of ourselves to fall away so that we can live more humanely with each other, right? And, you know, and so as I say, that part of what Baldwin in this tradition is trying to give us, it's not a policy, it's not a set of proposals, it's a way of, it's an orientation, right?
A way of being in the world.
A way of being in the world. And once we bring that on the table, then we ask the next question. Okay, what are the practices that can help, right, cultivate this in us? How can we help elicit this from us? But we can't even get to that question if we're not yet thinking about democracy as a way of being in the world, as a way of life.
I know we have one more time for one more question here.
Yeah.
We have two, or we have, I was pointing at you, and Marcus.
Okay. Thank you for this great talk, and I look forward to reading the book. I had two quick questions. One is about the relationship between rhetoric and genre. So the Black thinkers that are under review in your book are working across different genres. I wonder if you find that different genres sort of enable different conceptual claims about democracy or theoretical claims about democracy in different ways. And the second question is about the relationship between the endurance of Black faith and the enduring question of rationality, in part because it seems to me that the Black nationalist critique of faith is that there's something irrational about it, insofar as racism is irrational and arbitrary, as you put it. So I wonder if your account of democracy considers the question of rationality at all, or your account of faith considers that question.
Right. So on the first question of rhetoric, if we take seriously democracy as a way of life, then it's not just simply how it lives in our institutions and it lives in our laws, it's how it lives in us, how it lives in our very bodily comportment. So I spend a good deal of time in one of the chapters discussing Billie Holiday and her performances of Strange Fruit. And the way in which her mother didn't want her to perform this, but she thought this could make things better. Strange Fruit emerges as Abel Maripol is viewing a lynching photograph. He writes a poem, Bitter Fruit, that then acquires this new title, and Billie Holiday makes it a hit. And what's striking about Billie Holiday is not simply that she sung the song, but her performances, in which she attempts somatically, at the level of the body, to perform what she's trying to elicit from her audience, right? That as she sort of provides a grimace, as she cringe, she wants you to perform that, in contrast to the ways in which lynching photographs were in circulation as a source of jubilation. This is what makes the fruit strange. It is not a source of sustenance. It deforms, right? And so the thought is that democracy doesn't just simply live in our institutions, it should live in us and in our bodily comportment. And that those performances are also her rhetorical attempts, right, to move her audience to a new place. I think the second question, very fascinating. Chapter 4 is the chapter that really sort of directly bears on this. And part of what comes up in this chapter is the disagreement between Martin Delany on the one side, Frederick Douglass and Anna Julia Cooper on the other, in which Martin Delany uses the sort of evidence and the sort of empirical interactions between blacks and whites as the only ground for engagement. And Frederick Douglass and Anna Julia Cooper sort of try to say that, look, for anyone who's using this sort of strong evidentiary basis, our approach will always seem irrational. Right? But the interesting thing is that when has radical political transformation come about? Because actors have been proceeding rationally. Often the world around them is telling them precisely the opposite of the thing that they're trying to bring about. And it's precisely it's precisely because they're animated by a vision of human life that is not yet, a vision of our shared relationships that are not yet, that then orients them in time and space as the condition for bringing it into existence, right? And so that for them, it is not at all clear how democratic transformation could ever come about, independent of faith, right? Even as it is constantly courting, right? Even as it's constantly revealing the inadequacy of the evidence needed to justify what's fueling it.
Can we give Professor Rogers a round of applause?